Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching.
He sought greatness in everything he did. He conquered the known world in a few years and was thought to be more God than man. And when he died, he left behind warring empires, a common basis of Greek culture, and a memory that has fascinated men ever since. Alexander the Great, this time on the Western tradition.
And now UCLA Professor Eugen Weber's continuing journey through the history of Western civilization.
In the year 401 BC, a Persian prince raised a force, a very large force of about 12,000 Greek mercenaries to fight his older brother, the king, for the Persian throne. Now, the prince was killed in the first major battle, and even though his Greek mercenaries defeated the huge Persian army, the Greeks found themselves in the middle of Persia, very close to Babylon, without any friends and without any leaders. They had to march 1,000 miles to the Black Sea coast, and then 500 more miles along the coast to Byzantium, across horrible terrain and fighting all the way. But they made it. And this epic long march persuaded both Greeks and non-Greeks that the mercenaries' hoplite phalanx, this wedge formation of heavily armed infantry, that the phalanx was invincible. And they reasoned further that if only the Greek infantry had good cavalry support, no power on earth could withstand them. A prediction that turned out to be as accurate as it seemed sweeping. The story of these mercenaries, who were known as the 10,000, was told by one of them, an Athenian soldier named Xenophon. And by the time Xenophon died, around 355 BC, a new power was rising in the ancient world that would bear out the inspiration of the 10,000's famous march, the power of Macedon. The Macedonians were really Greeks, but the Greeks didn't consider them to be so any more than 16th century Scots were considered English. These are Macedonian ruins. Back in the 5th century before Christ, Macedonia was still a wild country with a feudal system of rural tribes and clans. A hereditary king had religious and military power over all this, and over his people, at least in theory. This is what remains of the royal palace. Although the Macedonian royal house and nobles were attracted by Greek culture and quite Hellenized, the land remained a backwater until mid-4th century BC, when a Macedonian king named Philip tamed the local warlords. He did it by subjecting all free men to conscription and by making them serve in regular royal troops under his own offices. Philip copied the military methods of these Greek soldiers, but improved on them, combining the phalanx with light infantry, and more importantly, with a heavy cavalry that the 10,000 never had. The Macedonians could mount a formidable cavalry force because their country had great plains and broad estates where the nobles especially rode from their early youth. As the world had surmised 50 years before, no power on earth was able to stop them. Philip set out with his army to dominate or conquer most of the Greek cities, and he succeeded brilliantly, not only because he had a superior fighting force, highly integrated, very loyal to him, but also because the Greek polis were divided, even more divided than usual. The Persians had been working hard to keep them that way so that they would continue to fight each other instead of the Persian Empire.
Philip was able to beat the Greek polis handily, but the only thing that could then unite them under his rule was an appeal to them, not as Athenians or as Corinthians, but as Hellenes. As Philip knew well, to be a Greek in those days was to be a free citizen, as contrasted to a barbarian subject of a despot, as the Persians were. It was to cherish the pride of Salamis and Plataea, great victories over the Persians. Most important, it was to aspire to a fuller vengeance on the invader of the past, the Persians again, who still ruled the Greek cities of the Near East.
There was also the lost wealth of those eastern cities to regain, and there were the precedents of myth and legend in which heroes like Heracles had done great deeds in the East. In fact, when Philip's son, Alexander the Great, crossed into Asia in 334 BC, he took a side trip to the site of ancient Troy to convince his public that a new Achilles, Alexander himself, was arming for the traditional feud between Greek and Asian. And so, from the beginning of the 4th century BC, we find the idea growing among the Greeks of a war of reprisal against the Persians, a war of conquest in Asia that would diffuse internal conflict by turning Greek violence and energy outward from the homeland. Such a war could also open new areas for commercial expansion and for colonization. As it were, the Greeks were checked in the West by the power of Carthage, and they were encountering local resistance to their colonies in Italy. In fact, the Greek colonial world hadn't grown since the 7th and the 6th centuries BC, but it needed to grow, because constant warfare so hurt the economy and especially the agriculture that it couldn't support even a stagnant population. So Greece sent out some of its excess people, artisans like this blacksmith, the young and adventurers, artists and scholars, and engineers and traders, but it founded no new cities and it found no real solution to its problems of overpopulation except for war.
All these arguments for a war against the Persians were invoked by the Macedonians, but they didn't always work, because many Greeks liked the Macedonians even less than they liked the Persians, who were further away and not as familiar. Still, as long as Philip and his son Alexander proclaimed themselves champions of Hellenism, even if they couldn't talk some cities into supporting them, at least they could shame them into staying neutral. The Macedonians also worked hard to intimidate the Greek mercenaries, who were in the habit of selling themselves to the highest bidder, which was dangerous because the great king of Persia could bid a lot higher than Philip and Alexander could. But the mercenaries
quickly got the message when they were declared traitors to the national cause, to the Hellenic cause, and massacred or sent off to work in the mines as slaves, which was a lot worse than being killed. And so a national war to conquer the Persian Empire in Asia became the grand design. Although King Philip was assassinated in 336 BC before he could carry it out, his son Alexander proved equal to the task. Alexander, who was 20 when he succeeded his father, was a pupil of Aristotle. He had read Xenophon, and he knew what could be done and what could be won in Asia. So in 334 BC, he led the Greek and Macedonian forces across the Hellespont into Asia Minor. He then overthrew the Persian Empire. He conquered all the lands from Libya to Afghanistan. He created a Greco-Macedonian empire that would spread Greeks and Hellenism all over the East, and he did all this in only 11 years, after which he died of a fever in Babylon, aged 32 or 33. Alexander was truly one of the greatest generals of all time and a megalomaniac of genius. Time has softened his more brutal aspects, but it's worth remembering that the ruthless Macedonian general Cassander, who knew Alexander as a young man, could never pass his statue without shuddering. Because Alexander's conquest seemed impossible, everybody except those who knew him thought he was more than a hero. He was a god. Soon, Alexander decided that he should be treated as a god, which was also rather convenient because it fitted in with Oriental traditions where the divinity of a king was the basis of his authority. One of Alexander's bequests to history would be the memory of his megalomaniac ambition and the leader cult that grew up around him. It would later inspire ambitious and ruthless men who wanted to equal his achievements. Men like Julius Caesar and Napoleon. Another aspect of this extraordinary man was the way he appears to behave as a philosopher king of the kind that Plato described and that Aristotle may have trained him to be. Alexander made sure that philosophers and scientists would be part of his expeditions to observe and record everything they could, and he sought greatness in everything he did. When he burnt down the Persian royal palace at Persepolis in retaliation for the Persians' burning of Athens a century and a half before, he followed it up with a mass marriage between Persian maidens and Greek nobles, a symbol of the fusion he hoped to accomplish of Greeks and other peoples in order to create one great everlasting empire. But reality couldn't be bent to obey Alexander's dream. The worlds his conquests brought together were too different, and when he died, they split apart. These new empires and the culture they represented were neither Greek nor Asian, but rather a bit of both, which is why they are described not as Hellenic, not purely Greek, but as Hellenistic.
The subsequent period, called the Hellenistic Age, spanned the three eventful centuries between the death of Alexander in 323 BC and the death in 30 before Christ of Cleopatra, who was descended from one of Alexander's generals.
It was an age that looks remarkably like our own time. We find the same reversion from representative institutions to authoritarian regimes, the same sense of psychological and aesthetic fragmentation, the same anti-rationalist trends, the same self-absorbed interest in the self, the same obsessive pursuit of affluence, exotic cults, peculiar fads, astrology, magic, eroticism, the same preoccupation with bigness, the same detachment from the hometown, with a concomitant but not very comforting feeling that the whole cosmos is your polis, the same social conflicts and class wars and colonialism and wars of national liberation designed to expel foreign oppressors and to allow the locals to oppress each other. The same bureaucracy more interested in making and keeping rules rather than in making things more productive or more efficient. The same retreat from political involvement. The same cringing sense of depersonalization in the big city, in megalopolis, a place of which name actually exists in Greece, in Arcadia. So let's take a closer look at this strangely familiar period. The states that Alexander's generals founded in the Hellenistic Age, like that of Ptolemy in Egypt or Seleucus in Babylon, these states were traditional monarchies, highly regulated and bureaucratic, but the cities and the royal courts and the armies and the higher officials were mostly Greek with cosmopolitan Greek values. Although the Greeks and Macedonians intermarried with the local people, and a lot of the locals were Hellenized, none of this integration went very deep. The difference was too great between the people in the relatively sophisticated, relatively free, literate, Greek-speaking urban centers and the people in the unfree countryside, those immense regions where the king exercised direct authority as absolute master over his servile subjects. Greeks were reluctant to accept the authority of monarchs who demanded adoration in the Oriental fashion, and they didn't believe in their divinity or infallibility either. Instead, the Greeks continued to maintain that law and institutions were products of reason, not of some divine revelation. So there was no true cultural synthesis in the Hellenistic Age. As you can see from this Roman fresco of Syria on the right contemplating Macedonia, the two cultures remained mostly suspicious and contemptuous of one another, even though they lived side by side. One way of looking at the Greek and Macedonian colonies during this period is to compare them with the settlements of the British in India in the 19th and 20th centuries. In both cases, an expatriate ruling class in an ocean of foreigners keeps the flag flying in their clubs and cantonments with their peculiar social rituals, which are designed to mark not synthesis, but distinction and superiority. This kind of separatism could provide no basis for real integration, nor was any kind of integration desired. But it did offer impressive models for the surrounding populations. Just as British laws and administrative practices and the English language and even cricket have been taken over and adapted in India and throughout the rest of the empire, which the British hold no more. Unintegrated as these Greek and Macedonian cities were in the Hellenistic Age, they were going to be vehicles of Hellenization, spreading Greek culture, institutions, ideas, styles, and language as far away from Greece as Afghanistan and India. Let me give you an example. These are the ruins of a Greek city on the northern border of Afghanistan at Ai-Khanum. We know that the men who founded the city probably came from Thessaly in central Greece. And from the inscription on the pillar, we know also that another Greek, probably a philosopher, made an extraordinary journey here, presumably because he knew he would find communities interested in hearing him lecture. In this particular city, which was only excavated about 20 years ago, there was a gymnasium, that very Greek institution of culture and training where youths met for exercise and discussion. And there was a large administration area which contained a library. This papyrus document was found in the library ruins, and it's written in Greek. And here is the temple inside the city walls and the residential area with mosaic floors. And all sorts of things that typify a Greek city. And these Greek institutions and Greek traditions continued strong here at the end of the world until the city was destroyed by nomads from the steppes in the late 2nd century. So this is how the Greeks exported their urban culture throughout the Hellenistic world, a world which grew to be larger and more closely linked than anything before it. When Alexander's wars of conquest were over, he had quadrupled the size of the Greeks' known world, and that gave a great impetus to travel and trade. Most of the overland trade went by caravan over tracks beaten hard by the hooves of pack animals. But the Persian kings had also built an impressive post road which ran 1,500 miles from Sardis on the coast to their capital at Susa. It was lined with stables, with hostelries, with forts. During the Hellenistic Age, roads and tracks were used mostly by soldiers and officials, but they also improved the movement of goods when these couldn't be shipped by water, which was, of course, much easier. And this trade was going to grow tremendously because the wealth of rulers and of cities increasingly depended on exchange with other regions. In fact, Hellenistic rulers were really merchant princes. There were trade expeditions to Africa and Arabia and India for elephants and incense and spices and slaves. The size of merchant ships kept growing as well. Syracuse in Sicily even launched a ship with a capacity of 4,500 tons. And the circulation of money grew too. This is a silver coin from Phoenicia, and here is one from Syracuse. At the same time, a Greek dialect called the Koine was providing a common language from Gibraltar to the Caspian Sea, which greatly facilitated trade and the spread of Hellenistic culture as well. A Greek intellectual like this physician could feel equally at home in Alexandria, which was in Egypt, or in Syracuse in Sicily. Act chapters had international associations with chapters in every important city, like the Guild of Dionysiac Artists. And athletes joined such groups as the International Boxing Association. And if you wanted to worship goddesses like Isis here, you could find their temples wherever you went. And so, in the 200 years before the birth of Christ, ideas, fashions, and goods were spreading remarkably fast.
Ironically, it was the decay of the classical Greek polis, so admired for centuries. It was its decay that gave birth to this new era. It brought about an openness to the outside world and the beginning of a certain cosmopolitan, even human solidarity. And this decay of the polis, which also undermined the classical disciplines with their order, with a certain rigor, or at least a certain impersonality, this decay of civic bonds and disciplines permitted, encouraged, a new spirit of eclecticism that is highly characteristic of the Hellenistic Age. We shall see how this changed the way in which people looked at their world then, and the way in which we look at our world now in our next program. So please join us then.
Funding for this program is provided by Annenberg CPB to advance excellent teaching. For information about this and other Annenberg CPB programs, call 1-800-LEARNER and visit us at www.learner.org.